Hey everyone, I'm Colette. Welcome to the Gathering Table, a Ragamuffin community. This is Palm Sunday. It would be if you're counting the sixth Sunday in Lent, although it's never called that, it's always called Palm Sunday. And until recent years, when I learned that it's also called Passion Sunday. So if you are from a more traditional church background or faith background, then you might know of Passion Sunday. When I was growing up, it was always called Palm Sunday, and we always got to walk around, whether I was a young girl or even as an adult, always got to walk around the sanctuary and waving palms. And not that I really understood what that meant back then, but certainly found it pretty cool to get to walk around the sanctuary, because let's be honest, usually you don't have permission to walk around the sanctuary, but on Palm Sunday we had permission to walk around the sanctuary and wave our palms, and there was always some really uplifting hymn that we were singing as we entered into the sanctuary. I mean, it was a really big deal. It is a big deal. It depicts Jesus entering into Jerusalem, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Today I'm going to combine a couple of passages. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm taking a look at Isaiah 50, starting with verse 4 and going through 9a. And then the other passage that I will read through is from Luke, and it's chapter 19, and it starts with verse 28 to 40. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about Isaiah and what's going on in the passage that I mentioned. Excuse me, now is a great time to grab your Bible or your device if that's something that you like to do. And this passage in Isaiah is about the suffering servant, and there are actually 4 such passages in the book of Isaiah, and this is the third of those 4. And this one in particular focuses on what I am terming today bold confidence. We have the picture of a servant who has come to bring a very unpopular word to the people. Remember that Isaiah was very much walking through as a prophet the season of exile with the people, the Jewish people, the Israelites. And Isaiah brought a very, just like this suffering servant, unpopular word. So what Isaiah does as a prophet with God, what God does through Isaiah, and what we see depicted here in the suffering servant is it's like the suffering servant is looking out, almost like the suffering servant is speaking from a mountaintop. So imagine that the suffering servant is on this mountain and kind of like looking, not only surveying what's down below near where the suffering servant is standing, but also then kind of looking out beyond. And in this scenario, the suffering servant is talking about a time that is coming that doesn't look anything like what they're in. So the suffering servant is speaking into life something that doesn't currently exist. So the suffering servant has been equipped, trained, gifted, empowered by God to do this work, to bring about this teaching, bring it to the people. But what's the people's response? The suffering servant comes with bold confidence. The suffering servant says, I know that this is not a popular message, and you're going, not only are you O Israelites, you are, in fact, attacking me. You're bringing opposition to me. And when that happens, and as that happens, ultimately what's occurring is God is saying through the prophet Isaiah, attack my suffering servant, and you're attacking me, because God sends the suffering servant. God sends the servant to experience suffering. Servant isn't doing anything wrong. The servant is doing exactly what God has called them to do. And the reason that I'm not saying him here, called him to do, is because servants are both male and female. Servants are all of us. And as such, the servant is sent out in the world. And the servant experiences suffering at the hands of those who oppose this calling into life or speaking into life, something that does not yet exist, at least in the minds of the hearers and those who think they see that. But do they really see? Because the response, is to oppose. The response is to reject. The response is, and rather also reaction, is to say, servant Isaiah, whoever you are, we're not interested in what you have to say, because we have become comfortable. So the Israelites, even though they were in exile, many of them had become comfortable with the life that they had created for themselves. They'd kind of carved out their own little niche, their own little place. I don't know that they would have said that it was ideal, but they had come to make a life, and they had come to be okay with that. As I said, come to be comfortable with that. And if we look then to what happens in the Gospel of Luke, we can also say that. So before I get too far down that path, I'd like to read you the Gospel of Luke, and then I'll go back and talk a little bit about what I think the Gospel of Luke is saying to us today. So again, Luke 19, I'm starting with verse 28. After he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. This is Jesus. And when he had come near Bethphage and Bethany, at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of the disciples, saying, go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter, you will find there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here, and if anyone asks you, why are you untying it, just say this, the Lord needs it. So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, why are you untying the colt? And they said, the Lord needs it. Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he now was approaching the path down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power they had seen, saying, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, order your disciples to stop. And he answered, I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. So getting back to that opposition, in Isaiah, the opposition came from the Israelites who were in exile. At least that's what we think. They'd become comfortable with the Babylonian lifestyle, and they had become okay with what was happening. So we can now fast forward to the time of Jesus, and we can see the leaders, the Pharisees specifically here, who are telling Jesus, you need to tell these people that they are way too loud. They need to quiet down, or as they said, you just need to order your disciples to stop. Why would the Pharisees ask Jesus to tell the disciples to stop being so loud, to stop? Because they were comfortable. The Pharisees were quite comfortable with. The Pharisees had kind of carved out for themselves, much like the Israelites in exile, this kind of, a bit precarious perhaps, but this kind of life with the Romans, right? They'd kind of found their way to make this work, and they didn't want anything to mess it up. Because they had gained a little bit of power, even though they weren't in control. They'd gained a little bit of power. They had a little bit of respect. They had a little bit of recognition. And so they didn't want anything to mess that up. And so they are opposing Jesus. They are especially opposing Jesus' disciples and saying, look, this has got to stop. And just like with the suffering servant, if you go back and read that passage, the servant couldn't stop what God had already set in motion. Jesus couldn't stop what God has set in motion here in Jerusalem. Jesus is not going to stop these disciples from shouting. In fact, what Jesus says is, go ahead and try and stop them, and even if they do get stopped, the rocks, actually it says here, the stones would shout out. In other words, it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what you say, that God's creation is going to proclaim, is going to shout out the good news of God. And God's love and grace and mercy and forgiveness, that cannot be shut down. Well, what is it that takes place here in Jerusalem that the Pharisees don't want to happen? Well, you've got some odd things happening. So you have Jesus entering into Jerusalem, and now remember, the Passion side of the story is that Jesus enters into Jerusalem right before he's crucified. The Palm Sunday part of the story is that Jesus enters Jerusalem as a triumphant king. Now remember, this is what the people had been waiting for hundreds of years, is for the Messiah to come in power and strength and leadership. And so this is like the best day ever. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is finally going to have his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And what does Jesus do? He rides into town on a donkey. Yeah. A donkey. He didn't come the way that they expected. Because the way that they expected was almost like the knight, in shining armor on this beautiful, huge white horse, because they expected someone to overthrow the Roman Empire. Didn't go that way. God has a way of doing that in our lives. Certainly he did it in the lives of those in Jerusalem and the lives of the Pharisees. He turns, once again, it's the great reversal. He turns everything upside down, and he comes in on this donkey, much to the disciples' disappointment. Actually, much to our disappointment. Because I'm wondering if we're really honest with ourselves, if that's what we're really seeking. Is for God to come in, on a white horse, and to be that one that overthrows the empire, that overthrows the things in our lives that aren't going the way that we want, they aren't going the way that we planned, and yet here is God. And God will not be silenced. Jesus will not be silenced. The Holy Spirit will not be silenced. God is on the move. God is on the move in Jesus' day, and God is on the move in our day. Now, some of you might be thinking, how could that even be remotely possible? Have you looked at the news lately? Have you heard the news lately, Colette? Well, I have, and I've also seen places in my own life over the course of my lifetime where things haven't gone my way. And in my younger years, I didn't have, even though I believed in God, I believed that God was with me, I didn't have a framework. I didn't have a language to be able to recognize what Jesus is doing here, this kind of, to have that bold confidence. I didn't recognize that God is a sending God, and that God equips and trains and teaches and gifts, and that there is suffering in this way of Jesus. There is. It is inevitable. It's unavoidable. It is a part of this life experience with God. Actually, it's a part of this human experience, whether we walk with God or not. So what do we do with that? How do we deal with the fact that our lives maybe don't go the way that we've planned, the way that we want, that our plans, all of our wonderful and great plans that we've got all figured out, what do we do with it which actually usually is the case, when it doesn't work out that way? So who are we in the story is the question. Are we the servant with the bold confidence who says, I am not moving from this spot. I am going to speak into existence what appears to not be? But I guess the challenge is, it does exist. Hope does exist. We can be boldly confident in hope, because God has shown over and over and over again that God brings us hope. Look at how God provided for the Israelites in exile. He made a way where there seems to be no way. And a lot of them, what did they do? They responded by saying, okay, thank you very much. We've gone as far as we're going to go. Now we're comfortable, and please don't challenge that comfort. Same thing with Jesus' day. The disciples were super stoked because they were going into Jerusalem, and finally Jesus is the King, Lord of Lords, right? King of Kings. And he rides in on a donkey? Come on. No. That's not what we want. It's not what we planned. It's not what our heart's desire says. Don't want to. Who wants to go through the suffering part? Who wants to have that experience? Where is the hope in that? How can we stand in the midst of suffering with bold confidence? Merely for the sake of it? No. That's not what God says. God's not saying pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, make it work, make it happen. God is saying, I am in the midst of it. I haven't called and equipped and trained you apart from suffering. I have done all of that in the midst of it, right? It's in the midst of it. And because God has done that, there is hope. So who are we in the story? I've already talked about whether or not we're the servant, the suffering's known to us as the suffering servant. Are we the opposition? Are we the ones saying, absolutely not, forget about it, not going to go there at all? I'm comfortable where I am, God. Even though it wasn't exactly my plan, I've kind of staked my claim here. I'm camping out. I've been challenged enough. Thank you very much. It's not an either or, though. There's another option. You could be one of the bystanders. We could be one of the bystanders. Not making a decision one way or the other. Kind of hanging back, checking it out. Not sure which way to go. But here's the thing. This is what I'm seeing right now. If we're a bystander, we're missing out. Because life happens in the midst of all of this stuff. Yes, there's suffering in that, but there's also hope and joy and peace and love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. So the bystander completely closes off. I'm not doing any one of those things, I'm not going to oppose and I'm not going to support. Just hanging back. The opposition says, quite comfortable. So is that where you are? Quite comfortable? You like where you are? You've kind of cocooned yourself, a way of being protected? Or do you find yourself that suffering servant who has been called and sent and trained, gifted and equipped, who has been sent out in mission, the one who can't not do what God has sent you out to do? That's where I find myself landing most of the time in my life. Every once in a while, I'm the opposition. I'm the one who's comfortable, and I like that. I like where I am or where I have been at certain points in my life, and I have intentionally said, God, aren't I surrendered enough, God? Haven't I been challenged enough? Haven't I suffered enough? And Jesus comes along and reminds us and reminds me of the ultimate suffering, of the ultimate sacrifice, and that Jesus does that on my behalf, on our behalf, and that the way of a Christian is the way of experiencing suffering. And I guess for me, I would like to be on the path and the journey of hope and redemption and reconciliation and renewal. And I've, I guess, been around enough or on the path long enough to know that that comes. That is coming. It has come. And it will continue. And I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss it. And so Palm Sunday, in a way, if you think about they didn't have palms in Jerusalem, or some of them did cut branches. That's where we get palms, I guess. But I guess my point is, what I'm thinking about is, think about, they laid down whatever they had. Right? It says they laid down their cloaks. Some went and cut branches. Whatever they had access to, they laid it down so that Jesus could walk over it. Right? So maybe with bold confidence, maybe that's what we're being invited into, is into bold confidence, where we boldly and confidently lay down under Jesus's feet the stuff that's in the way, the stuff that's in our way that hinders us from that hope that only Jesus can bring. Well, certainly a lot to unpack and reflect and ponder this week. And guess what next week is? Easter. So friends, have a great week, and may the time that we have spent together today be one that draws you nearer to God in some way, and nearer to those around you, for it's always about relationship with the one who created us, and relationship with those that God created, and that is each other. I look forward to seeing you next time when we celebrate Easter. See you soon.